All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Dr. Michelle Hardee. I am the TA Training Program Manager here at the university, but I also am an instructor in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and so I've been teaching marine science and geology for a very long time. And one of the things that I think is really important for new instructors, even experienced instructors, to think about is how important assessments are and how you need to really think about, reflect on what your assessments are doing for your students. And so I think, especially with the pandemic and having moved online, probably a lot of our assessments have changed significantly. We may be rethinking them, thinking about them more in how they are benefiting our students. So what I want to do is give y'all some examples and some things to think about with respect to what to think about and how you want to change things. So what we'll be looking at is, what is an assessment? Basically, what are the purposes of assessments? What are some qualities of them, good ones, and why it's important? And those of you who have not heard of Bloom's, which if you've been in any of my workshops, you will have heard of Bloom's once or twice. Bloom's is an important part, but then majority is going through some examples, types of assessments, how you can modify them as alternatives, okay? And we're going to be doing a little bit of practice as well. So when you think of an assessment, basically most people say assessments are assignments. And that's, yes, that is what they are. But when you hear the word assignment, what do y'all think? What comes to mind? Grades, exactly. What else? Homework, yes. Things that you have to do, kind of rote type of stuff. And so, yes, assessments are assignments. They do allow you to assess the learning of students. So yes, you get grades, but know that assessments, good assessments, can be lower stakes learning exercises. It doesn't necessarily have to be a high stakes assignment, and that is really important. And the other thing that you should think about is that your assignments, your assessments really do need to be more than grades. There should be a purpose, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. When we say more than grades, we want to think about, why are you giving that assignment? What is the reason behind putting that assignment into your syllabus, into the learning scheme of your class? So basically, your assessments should assess, evaluate, give you information on, yes, are they mastering the content? Of course, I know with nursing, they have to take a nursing exam, correct? And so there's a lot of content that has to be on there. Assessments need to show that they have developed knowledge, skills, abilities that are important to your discipline. But also, are they really getting the knowledge and the understanding to use it, to understand it, to apply it, those higher levels of thinking, and we'll get into that. And then, are they ready to move forward to the next topic? So several of y'all are in engineering. I think we're all in disciplines that content builds on content. Are they ready to move to that next step, okay? But assessments also tell you whether you're teaching well or not. I think when you do an assessment, and students don't do well, you want to think about, was it how I presented the material? Was it the assessment itself? Were there problems in the assessment? Where is that disconnect happening? And so how you assess, that method that you use, the technique, the style of that assessment impacts your student learning. And I think that is a really key statement, that you recognize that what that assessment does, how it actually works, the method you use, how you ask questions, will determine what high quality or low quality learning is actually happening, okay? Now that sounds like a really kind of high bar to reach, but know that y'all have that knowledge to develop those types of assessments. And I'll show you kind of what I'm talking about in just a second. So you want to think about what it is that you do want to assess. You think about a textbook, textbooks being, what are they now? 300 pages, 500 pages, really big textbooks. there's so much content in there. You absolutely cannot teach it all. I know you want to. I know people think that they need to. But you really need to think about what is it that I want them to take away from the course that I consider quality learning. So yes, knowledge, but also how that knowledge is applied. Every discipline that we have has different types of knowledge that we apply in different scenarios. Are you getting them to show you the process of their thinking, or are you wanting to see the end product? That's something you want to think about. Are you getting them to develop communication skills, expressing ideas, writing? I know that having taught freshmen versus honor students, writing skills are very diverse in university, basically. Are you trying to get them to show you that they know how to come to a conclusion with all sorts of evidence, or have divergent thinking where they're actually trying to figure out a solution? And then, as I mentioned before, with your health and your medical fields and other fields as well, are you wanting just to see they have competency, or they're actually showing progress through these learning stages? So all of this, all of these different things that you can assess with your assessments should all go back to addressing learning outcomes. So someone who is experienced with teaching, what are learning outcomes for those who are not? So what it is that the course is supposed to be teaching. Every syllabus has learning outcomes. There may be 5, there may be 7 or 8, but this is the point of offering the course. So you want to think about, are these assessments that I'm assigning actually tied to what the course is supposed to be teaching them? And typically they do, but often when you look at some of the more daily assignments, some of the discussions, the participation grades, they don't. They're actually not tied to necessarily learning outcomes, and so kind of a waste of time. So you want to think about what's the value in the assessment that you're actually having your students do. So what assessments should provide students are how well they've mastered the content. So assessments should be valuable to the students. You want them to understand that there's more to an assessment than just a grade. They should have a purpose, and tell your students that. Be transparent, saying, this assessment, this is why I'm having y'all do this. But you also want it to get students to want to learn more, inspire them to perhaps delve into the content more deeply, and allow them to show what they can do with it, why it's important in this field, how they're going to use it outside of this field. All of those are very important. And then allows them to see how I am doing. So self-assessment of their learning is important, and a lot of students don't actually do that. They don't think about, am I learning this the right way? Do I need to rethink how I'm studying? Those types of things, okay? So let's look at the different types of assessments. We have, and this ages me very much, Spy versus Spy. It's a very old comic where you had two spies that were always trying to blow each other up, one versus the other. They were opposites. And so we have what we call summative assessments, which are your traditional, what we call formal assessments, such as exams, 3 exams and a final, actually even sometimes a final project, but that can vary a little bit. But basically, formal assessments where they go, they do it, they get the grade, and you move forward. The other main type of assessment is what we call formative. And formative, when you think of the word formative, what does that make you think of? Has a certain format? Okay. What else? Forming knowledge as you go? Yeah, absolutely. So formative is basically assessments as you are doing the content in the class, helping them take the knowledge that they just learned, putting into practice while you're there. Because that's where they can then ask questions and say, I don't get this, what am I doing wrong? Versus taking an exam where they either get it right or wrong, too bad, we're moving forward, okay? So summative assessments, we also call them auditive. What an audit is. Basically, did you report everything to the IRS? Basically, if not, you're in trouble. These are, again, your traditional exams, multiple choice, very capsulated view. So did they get it, kind of a picture of whether they learned or not. These also tend to be, but don't have to be, but they do tend to be lower level thinking. You can, and that's a whole nother workshop, how to write multiple choice questions that address higher levels of learning. But typically these are lower level of what we call Bloom's taxonomy thinking processes. And so they either get the answer right or wrong, and so you don't necessarily see how they have learned perhaps some of the skills that they did develop or did not develop. That is not answered in your summative assessments. And so really, summative assessments are so you can administer the assessment, across 300 students at a time. That's really what those tend to help out with. And they are not what we call prescriptive. They don't give information about what the student needs in order to learn that better or needs to go back and redo, essentially. So that's kind of part of the issue with summative assessments. Formative are kind of the opposite. They are in the course as they're going, as they're learning the material. They are incremental. So you can do formative assessments where you step them through the process of learning in the class, helps them build on that understanding. At the same time, when you do good formative assessments, they both assess their learning and then teach them how to apply it and move through that content. So they do two things at one time. So formative assessments need to be what we call authentic. And authentic means like real life. Why would you want to give an assignment to a student that they would never see in real life? I mean, that's a waste of time, a waste of energy for your students. So how it is that the discipline works, how real life works, how industry works, give them those examples. You're very welcome. They need to be diagnostic. So gauging that learning, gauging how well they understand how to apply a theory or a model to real life. So that depth of understanding of learning, quality of learning, and how good that method is, that technique. Good formative assessments will tell you whether that assessment is a good one or not to use, essentially. Okay, questions on formative versus summative? You will continue to, oh, yes.
So you mentioned that traditional exams would be an example of summative, would like essays be an example of formative?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I say traditional exams meaning like, multiple choice, short answer, 3 exams per a class period. But if there are essays on that short answer, those are more formative questions on a summative exam. And so I highly recommend, that's something that I do is whenever I give exams to larger classes, when you give an exam to 200 students, you can't have, 10 essays. It's just not possible. But what I do is I always do include some type of formative questions where I ask questions that show me whether they actually learned it or not. So kind of application-based questions. And those are more formative as well. So it is on an exam, but it also is showing me, are they able to take like data and put it into a scenario and come out with a solution based on their understanding, kind of connecting things together. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay? Yes?
If formative assessments are going this way, and students are getting used to answering a certain type of questions, and then the summative assessment is a totally different type of question, and that will create a disconnect.
Yeah, it
and
does.
They can perform well on formative assessment and not perform that well on the summative assessment.
Yep.
But this is high stakes. This is low stakes.
Yes. So the disconnect is, so the way I view it is, the disconnect is we have been primed and programmed to always use summative. Why? Yes, it does help for grading, but is the learning actually happening? So why don't we just use more formative assessments in class and have that then in total be the grade that's given in the class?
I'm a big proponent of formative assessments. One of the things that I recommend to the faculty is that we aim at aligning the questions because you need to practice as you are going to play.
Absolutely, yes.
So the formative, the analogy that I use is that formative assessments are like a ladder that allow the student to climb to where they need to be when they are going to be presented with a summative assessment.
Yes, exactly. And actually, I'm about to talk about that because that is what we call staging.
Yes.
So using formative assessments to stage students through the thinking process, so when they are presented with like a case study or something in real life, they know the thinking process that needs to be done to solve that problem. And formative assessments get them to that. So you can then design your course and let your students know, this is how I've designed it. We're going to be doing these assessments that build your skills so that when you take the exam or you do this final project, you can do it because you know what needs to be done, essentially. Yes, so I totally agree. Okay, other questions? Okay. All right, so in your little packet that I gave you, you have, of course, the slide set, but you have another couple packets as well. This is just a nice little assessment summary that I was able to find. They show 3 different ones. They have diagnostic, and that's more just figuring out what your students do or don't know, whether you need to do remedial work or not, and then formative versus summative. So you can see kind of the difference between the different types of assessments that are considered formative versus considered summative. Teacher-created tests, multiple choice, and here portfolio culmination, but portfolios are also showing the work that has been done. So portfolios can be both formative as they're developing their portfolio and the content in it, as well as the end product. So you can see here that there's a lot of different, really variable things that can be done in formative assessments. And when you look at it, you see these things and you're like, yeah, I would really learn well by doing those types of formative assessments. Okay. All right, so let's look at what things you want to consider when you're developing these different types, or basically formative assessments. Any good assessment is considering equitability across your students. All students are able to do it. It's something you have thought about. You know, you think about, are my students coming in with the knowledge that I need them to have? And this might be when you go back and do a diagnostic assessment to see whether they have that background knowledge or not. Is it reliable across all the students in the class across time, from one semester to the next? Is it valid? Is it asking and getting students to show the knowledge that they have gained, which is what you wanted to see from them? Okay. I also, as I mentioned, make sure that your assessments are transparent, meaning there's a reason for it, you're doing it intentionally, you tell your students why you're doing those assessments. I think that's very important to do. And you have realistic expectations where, you know, you have a class that have mostly freshmen and sophomores. You don't ask questions that you would ask for a senior level type of course. So it's realistic ability levels that you're assessing. But then it also shouldn't be too easy. I mean, if it's so easy for them to answer or to do that assessment, you're wasting your time and their time. So do one where they have to do that thinking, that cognitive processing that you want. And then, as I've already mentioned, it needs to have and incorporate, the majority of them should have authentic real-life examples, okay? And I'll show you several examples of these in just a little bit. Any other thoughts or questions about that?
What does it involve?
So it factors in several things. Let me give you an example. So I was talking to, like I said, I teach marine science, and I gave them an assignment where they were to identify the different barrier islands in South Carolina and talk about how these barrier islands were formed. And I went into the assessment itself, talked about Kiowa Island versus Hilton Head. And I assumed that the students knew where those were on South Carolina. And once they turned it in, there was a couple students who weren't really able to, first of all, didn't know how to read a map, which you think that students are, but students these days have never needed to learn how to do a map. They've always had Google Maps. So that was one bad assumption. I know, me either, exactly. Second assumption was 2 of the students had never been to the coast. So they didn't even think about what the island looks like, where it would be, how it would differ, why it would differ. And so that really made me rethink, when I ask these questions, what are my assumptions that I'm making about the students that are answering those questions? What is their background knowledge? Am I assuming too much? Those types of things, okay? Do you want to have an example that they've seen as well? I know the whole map thing was like, holy crap. Yeah.
I was curious that was in a class with like geography, I believe, and the instructor was talking about certain locations. It was my first semester in the U.S., so I had no idea where we were in different states, or each one was kind of warm weather or stuff before. I've actually been there myself.
Yep. Yeah, the one of the students who had misinterpreted the map didn't realize that the names in these shapes were county names. So things like that, you know, you just don't think about. Yeah, that was a real kick in the pants of learning experience. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Okay. Some things that you as the instructor need to ask. So as you're developing the assessments, this is what you want to start thinking. What is the knowledge that I want students to show? What is the learning that they both bring into the question, use, have the base understanding to apply that situation? What metacognitive knowledge? So what is metacognition? So thinking about thinking. Do I know enough to do this? Does this person have the skills? That's metacognitive knowledge. Do I have the skills to do this? So thinking about, can this assessment help students to think about what they need to go find or information they need to answer the problem or the question? Okay, kind of higher level thinking. What real life settings? How would they actually use this? You know, what problems can it address? One of the things that I have done through my career of teaching, I've been teaching for 25 years, is making sure that the questions are things that they have seen. You know, here in South Carolina, I ask questions about South Carolina geology, marine science, because that's likely what they will see. They won't necessarily see, you know, really strange things that I think is cool as a geologist. I think that would be awesome, but they won't see it, so don't ask a question about that. And then what is it that the student needs to do, the task, the assignment, the question style, in order for the assessment to truly show how that question, that content needs to be learned. So how, what tasks the students can do that best exemplifies an authentic approach to that question, okay? And then based on these questions, then you think about what kind of assessment type would work in this particular situation. Now, you're like, I have to ask these questions for everyone? No, these are kind of inherent in your knowledge already. So when you look at content, you can already be thinking, you know, in the back of your mind, this would be a really great type of assessment to ask about this or to get students to think about this. But this kind of helps break down what you're thinking about these assessments. Okay, so when you're developing an assessment, so of course, showing you guys blooms, love blooms. This is one of those things that when I started teaching long ago, I didn't know about this. This would have changed my entire trajectory of teaching had I known about this 25 years ago. I didn't. Blooms is what you use not only to, well, so let me back up. Blooms is what we call a taxonomy. Basically, it has different levels, and these levels represent cognitive thinking of your students, of yourself. So remembering, understanding, applying, these are higher and higher levels of cognitive thinking. So Analyzing, if you're able to analyze something, when you analyze, you're not only remembering and understanding content already, but you know how to apply it so you can analyze pros and cons, those types of things. Evaluation, you have to be able to do all of these to evaluate. And then creation is being able to do all of these and create something brand new in that style of content. So Bloom's, the beauty of Bloom's, first of all, it has these different levels. So these are what we call lower order thinking skills, or LOTS, L-O-T-S, that's how I remember it. And then these upper ones, about 3 and up, are what we call higher order thinking, critical thinking, or HOTS. So LOTS and HOTS. And Bloom's, the beauty of Bloom's is it gives you the verb to use in the sentence, in the question that you're asking. So it helps you get at that level of thinking that you want your students to do just by knowing which verb to use in that question, in that assessment. And I've given you in your packet, I'm going to show you a couple of these in just a second, but if you flip to page 4, this is I actually have this, I use this, a list of Bloom's taxonomy verbs to help you write your questions. I'm serious. Your educators go to Bloom's. They use Bloom's all the time. Because you're like, I can't think of a good word to get them to do this. Bloom's, okay? So this is another way of looking at Bloom's. There's a researcher that uses what we call taxonomy circles, basically Bloom's taxonomy in the circle representation. And what this shows you is the different levels of Bloom's are in purple, and some examples of the verbs are in yellow, and then in the teal are the assessments, the student products. So this allows you to see, in this situation, say we wanted students to do evaluation, critiques, appraise, assessments. They can do self-evaluation, group discussion, editorials, and these are just a few examples. But what this shows you is that there are resources out there to help you find assessment types to ask that level of learning. And the Taxonomy Circles, this website, so this researcher has put together this really great website where he breaks down the taxonomy circles into the cognitive domain, so this is those thinking levels of Bloom's, but then he also breaks them down into affective domains, so kind of your reaction, internalize, organize, values, respond, receive, so more interpersonal types of skills, if that's what your discipline is interested in developing. And then psychomotor. Are you, physical education? Do you want your students to be able to manipulate, formulate, show, calibrate, those types of things? And so I think this is a beautiful website to have to go and see what types of assessments can be used to address the different levels of Bloom's. Now, one thing I want to stress is, and I think this has become, there was a trend towards this going away from Word documents before the pandemic, then the pandemic hit. We're like, how do we do these assessments online? So we kind of fell back to old ways. But I want y'all to think that assessments don't have to be Word documents. They can be all sorts of different types of products, and we'll show you some more examples in a second of these different types of products. Yes, writing graphs, arguments, video types of arguments, reports, film strips, infographics, all sorts of stuff that students can do. Okay, one thing that, and I kind of put this in here, it's a little bit, it seems a little bit out of place, but let me describe what this is. When you're putting your assessments together, both in your course, as well as say you have an exam and you're looking at the questions that you're asking, always do what we call either a test item analysis or assessment analysis, looking at what level all of your assessments are reaching. So in this example, this would be, say, on an exam, multiple choice questions, true, false, matching, these are what levels those types of questions typically reach with Bloom's. Just basically remember, understand, maybe apply. If you have essays on the exam, then yes, you're getting at analyze, evaluate, create. But then not just for tests, but do this, and instead of having these things here, put your assessments in this column and then check mark what level of Bloom's they're assessing. And that can allow you to see, am I getting students to do those higher levels that I really want them to? So this is a great tool to use once you have your syllabus and your course content developed. Now let's look and see, is it doing what I want it to do? So let's look at some examples. I have pulled a lot of examples from my own courses that I've been teaching, and then I did some searches for some additional ones. But the first most basic type of assessment, formative assessment, are called CATs, classroom assessment techniques. CATs have been around for a very long time. They originated in 1993. Angelo and Cross wrote a Bible of CATs. This is the most amazing book ever. And what I've given you in your packet of information is a little summary of some really good ones. So I want you to look at this document. The beauty of the Angelo and Cross book is that they organize it based on what skills you want your students to do, what level skills. Are you assessing prior knowledge? Are you assessing critical thinking, problem solving, metacognition, attitudes? And then they also have discussions of the different types of techniques, all sorts of different assessments, portfolio descriptions. What's really great about this book is it talks about the background, what the results can be, pros and cons of the different types of assessment types. So this is just one example of all the different classroom assessment techniques, in-class techniques that are short, easy to do, but really truly show the learning that students have done. So these are formative, educative. Basically, we're teaching our students as they go through and learn the process. They can be quick, in class, very easy for you to gain a sense of whether or not they've gotten the material. And students then, as they're doing it, realize, oh, I thought I knew it. You know, yes, I think I listened, but did I really listen? No, I was distracted, those types of things. And that allows you to go back, make adjustments if you need to, go back over the content. So it basically is this baseline understanding of where your students are once you've covered a section of content, done an activity, those types, okay? So here's one very common, very well-known example called a 1-minute paper. And I show this because most people think, oh, it's a 1-minute paper, you ask a question, they answer it. There are so many different versions of OMPs, so many different ways you can apply this. So basically the students write something, a response to a question or whatever it might be. It could be group, it could be individuals. That question is one that you ask, and there's different ways to do it. You can have them, respond at the end of class. I typically don't do that. I like to do 1-minute papers within the class for them to answer, reflect on a question that I have, and then we discuss it during class, okay? Students respond, write down their thoughts. If they turn it in at the end of class, it allows you to adjust for next class. Again, I have them do it as kind of a reflection on learning before we move to the next set of content. Some other examples of 1-minute papers are one that I actually just kind of, not that I didn't know about it, but heard how beneficial it is last week. It's called a quick write, where you ask students a question or you pose them a problem, and they write down everything they know that might contribute to solving the problem, answering the question. And you just give them a minute to do it. Another one is what I learned from. Say you expected students to come into class having read material. That's hard to get students to do sometimes. And so if they know that coming into class, you're going to have them answer this 1-minute paper on the reading for a grade, the key is that it's not what was the content about, it's what I learned from the content. So that really gets them to think about the value of it, why you're having them read it, or important ideas. These are all variations on 1-minute papers. And so again, it gives you real-time feedback. It improves the instruction for you, so you can make modifications. You also can use it at the same time for attendance points, participation points. I do that. So I expect my students to be in class every day. And one way I take attendance is they've turned in the 1-minute paper or the other CAT assignment that I do every day in class. On an index card. So you can do it either way. Yeah, I am a fan of index cards. So yeah, you can do it electronically. You can have them submit it. One way to do it electronically that I did when we were in the pandemic was I had them send me an email, or you can do it on Padlet, where they posted the Padlet. Anyone not know what Padlet is? It's basically a website that is a board that you post Post-it notes with content. It can be anonymous. It can have the students' names. You can post pictures, videos. It's free. It's awesome. I use it in all of my classes. So that's 1-minute paper. So let's do an example to show you the value of this. On your index card, I'm going to give you about a minute to respond to this prompt. What is a concern of yours when trying to design a quality assessment? All right, will someone share what they wrote? Anyone want to share what they put down as a concern about developing assessments?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm in civil engineering, and because it's so based on math, one of the problems is developing an assessment where it's not just checking if they got the right answer, but if they got to the answer correctly, if they have the right process, being able to actually check that versus just okay, they got the right X value.
Yep, exactly. So how that can be addressed is when you're grading, not only is the grading the right answer, but the grading is the process, the thinking process, the stages that they went through. And you can let students know, I'm going to be looking at that. I think that's that is a very important part of your thinking in engineering or in medical field or whatever it might be, is that process of getting to it. So that's part of the rubric that you use when you grade those types of assessments. What else? Yeah?
It is difficult to create or write questions or create activities that actually accurately assess what it is that you want to assess.
Okay.
And for example, I spent 2 hours this morning in a discussion with a faculty member about a case study. And the case study is supposed to teach and at the same time assess the diagnostic reasoning process that the students are trying to master.
Yep.
So it unfolds in several steps. And we go from question 1, question 2, yes, 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 yes. Then she reads the next question to me, and it's a knowledge type question. We have just gone through 7 critical thinking questions, trying to push students, higher and higher and higher, or narrow and narrow and narrow your list of potential diagnoses so we can nail the one. And now you ask a knowledge type question.
Yeah.
And her response was, well, that question has always been there, so you need to take it out.
Right, yes. So really questioning the way it's always been done. Absolutely. That's really important. It's hard to do. It's hard to get faculty to do that. But the idea is that you're going back and rethinking standard traditional things that are being done.
And critical thinking is different from your knowledge base.
Yes.
It's so easy to assess the knowledge base, and we are so comfortable here.
Yes.
So even when we are operating in this other area, there's such a strong temptation. But now let me ask them if they know the basics.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that goes back to why doing those test item analyses type of displays really helps a lot. Someone else want to volunteer? Yeah.
So when you're trying to ask higher level questions on Bloom's taxonomy that may rely on experience and things of that nature, how to frame them in a way that they don't rely so much on experience and
Interesting.
seen some of that stuff.
Yeah. So can you give me an example of that?
If you're teaching a PE class, right, and I will know a little bit about what problems might occur, what somebody might look like when I give them this certain task to do, where they may not. And so I might know whether it's behavioral or, them interrupting the class or whatever. So them not anticipating issues that may arise and how they respond.
So that gets to, and that's a really good example, that gets to the idea of what is their prior knowledge, background knowledge? What are assumptions that you're making with that? What are some things that you can give them in the problem that addresses background knowledge they do or do not have that they may never experience? So you should give that information in the problem that you're giving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a lot of it that came from last semester. I was actually helping with make assessments, and the class was online.
Yeah.
So we usually incorporate a lab with this classroom to get some of that experience, and then that was kind of out the window. So.
Oh wow, yeah. So and that's another really great example. What I had done in mine when I went online was things that I would normally show in a demonstration class. I'd videotape myself doing that. And yeah, we did that for the marine science labs, but I also did it for marine science lecture, and I still use those now, even though I'm in person. So there is value to, yes, it's a little bit more work up front, but it does become valuable over time. So that's good. What's another one that someone else want to volunteer?
One issue that I have, and it's based on my own experience, is the fact that you design an exam and the students study for it, and maybe they get an A, and then 2 years later, they can't even remember the syllabus of the course. So that's kind of, I wasn't sure how to label that, but just that the memorability or like the active part of learning is one of the other main concerns that I hear.
Yeah, and that's where we go back to the moving away from, I know the exams have a purpose. Now, can we design exams and questions in them where they're more involved, where they're using examples that students would remember? Storytelling is a huge part of learning. If you can do storytelling in your exam questions, students will remember that story as they progress through those questions. So how do you make those questions more memorable? But you can't get away from the fact that even in well-designed courses, students are not going to remember everything. So what is it that you want to truly focus on that? That's a hard question to answer, basically. You have an example? You want to talk about yours?
I just worry that I'll rely too much on the idea that students completely understood the material.
Yeah. Yeah. So what, you're in education?
So I teach family counseling.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, yeah, that goes to the question of what you need to include in the assessment to make sure that, perhaps, as I mentioned, do staging. If they answer this question wrong, that shows you that they didn't get the material they need to move forward in the assessment. So yeah, that is a huge concern, definitely. Anything else that you wanted to mention with this? So why did I do this? Why did I have y'all do this minute paper?
See how long it actually takes to think and process.
Yeah. If I just asked the question, what would likely have been the response? I didn't give y'all time to write it down. Been crickets, probably. So this allows students to process the ideas, process their thinking, process their learning, but then gives them something to read from so it's not so anxiety-inducing for students who don't like to speak up in class. So it serves multiple purposes, okay? Another example of this, I use this a lot, concept tests where you have questions in either the lecture slides or in the material where they're doing real-time, real critical thinking. And you can do all sorts of different levels of concept tests. And I'm going to show you some examples. Sometimes I grade these. So I'll have them through the lecture. We stop, we answer the questions. And I'll use this both as the attendance, and then I grade them. Or I just have them answer in class. They raise their hands. They use the index cards. This is clickers. This is pull everywhere. That's what these are. Typically, and this is just a general guideline, when you see that, say, students answer about 35 to 70% correct, this allows you to say, okay, let's talk about the ones that you missed. Get with a group, talk about why you missed them. If fewer than 35% were missed or were correct, it may have been too difficult. You know, generally 70% they were too easy questions. That's just general. I mean, you can set your own standards for that. And then you then have that discussion about what the question answers were, talking about it, really reasoning out what the answers are. So these are actually pretty quick stuff. I am showing you here, this is a link in geosciences where literally for almost every discipline, if you Google, say, civil engineering concept tests, you probably will get responses back because these are so popular. Here's an example of a lower order concept test. This is the slide I put up. I asked them through these questions. You know, I answer them as we go. These are easy. And then this is kind of a rethink what you think type of question. When we have a high tide on one side, opposite of the Earth, the theory is another high tide. That's very low level blooms. Here's a little higher level blooms, where I give them a model of the Earth, an actual tidal pattern, and then I say, which of these locations will give me that tidal pattern? And I have them work in pairs to figure out the answer. So they get to talk with each other, reason through it. Again, this is during the class itself. They either turn it in as an answer for attendance, or this is just practice during the class, formative assessment. Okay. Another example, one sentence summary, another CAT. Have students, and there's a reason why I'm doing this one. So having students answer this question, who does what, when, where, how, and why of something. I've had students do this when we've talked about plate tectonics. I've said, what is happening, where, when does it happen, how is it happening, why is it happening? I mean, it doesn't have to be a person. So this allows them to really synthesize their learning, figure out what they don't understand, and be very concise with it. And so let's do one. On the other side of your card, I want you to write one sentence for this workshop today. Summarize who does what, when, where, how, and why. Go ahead and do that. Okay, I think some of you are still writing. Let me go ahead and have someone share what they wrote. Just read what you wrote. I'll ask you.
I summarized it as a workshop where the teachers or instructors or TAs learn how they can assess the students with different assessment types in the classroom.
Okay.
And after teaching a certain topic to ensure if they grasp the topic or not.
Okay, great. Does someone have something different from that? Do you have something different? Yes.
I was more specific. I did Dr. Hardee teaches developing quality assessments of the library via PowerPoint and interactive work to provide us with a better understanding of the topic.
Absolutely. Someone else have something different from that?
I'm not sure if it's different, but I just wrote what the reading, what the whole thing was about. So I wrote the who being the instructor was going to make an assessment, and that assessment is going to be probably after class, just before class ends. So, but after a particular subject, so part of it has been taught.
Yep.
In class, after class, whenever, and it's from the course content is to evaluate how much students have grasped that particular content and how much command they have over it in terms of understanding, you know.
Gotcha. So what that does is it shows really well how different the same question can be interpreted by your students. I always have, every time I do this, someone who is very generalized, someone who's very specific. I mean, Dr. Hardee did this at 12 noon in the library on Friday. I mean, that's not wrong, you know? So that helps you as the instructor see how students are interpreting it. But these types of assessments then allow you to bring in the discussion, why did you interpret it that way? Why did you interpret it that way? Tell me what your experiences are, talking about what your understanding is and how it can be different from others. So this really makes for a more richer discussion and understanding and learning of that particular content. When you're using CATs, you really want to make sure that you know what you're trying to assess about students' learning. Use one that does that and one that you're comfortable using. That's really key. And then tell students the purpose of doing it, why I'm having y'all do this assessment, what it's going to tell me, what you're going to learn. Again, always be transparent, okay? And then, of course, if you need to make changes, you can. So let me show you some variations that you may see. So say you wanted to see whether the students did reading each day. Maybe you could provide discussion questions and students answer in groups, have an in-class assignment worksheet, or create and do a quiz on the readings. Which ones would y'all be more likely to do? C? What else? Anyone else? A? Okay. Okay. So these are very specific to you, to your class. None of these are wrong. So what you want to think about is this assessment I'm using, what learning outcome does it address? Is the question I'm writing being educative or auditive? Does it encourage deeper reading or thinking? Am I just doing it for a check-in or attendance participation? What is the quality of that assessment? Another example, you assign a class discussion where you review core concepts. Do you host the discussion in an online platform? Do you use Blackboard discussions? Or do you use, say, Blackboard Collaborate or Zoom where they do breakout groups? Which one would you prefer to do? This one's more online. This one's much more tech heavy. So are you grading these? Is it just going to be a Q&A session? Do you track, or how will you track engagement? Is there going to be structure to these sessions? Will you give them specific questions? These may be easier because you're not familiar with these technologies. These are the things you want to think about when you're thinking about assessments again. All of these are fine, just want to think about the value of them. And then say you wanted to do clickers, in-class check of understanding as you go through class. Would you use a follow-along worksheet with questions, have a post-lecture exit ticket or quiz, or have some embedded quiz questions throughout the lecture? Which one are you more likely to do? C? Okay, anything else? C? Okay. So does that then achieve your learning outcomes? Are there reasoning behind those types of questions? Or is it for check-in? Is it for attendance? Are the questions helpful? What level are the questions addressing? Are they worthwhile questions? So these are things you want to think about. I want to show you some examples of problem-solving case-based assessment. So students showing their ability to apply material, critical thinking. These, as I've said, need to be just like real life, as similar as possible, showing how they analyze, synthesize, apply things. Use ones with, we've talked about this, use ones with graduated difficulty, staging them so that they build up that understanding and knowledge, get them to do that process. And use familiar questions and then new ones. So they practice with familiar ones, give them some new ones before you say, maybe give them an example of a new one on an exam. So they've had the time to practice that. So here's some examples. This is where I show them how to kind of reason through Coriolis Force. This one is where I get them to think about how winds blow from high to low. So they're not just listening to it, they're actually drawing, putting things in motion to figure out how that physical process is happening. Great formative assessment. This is one, earthquakes, where I give them a real case study of Christchurch, the earthquake that happened. I get them to compare two different earthquake scales, Mercalli, what was felt, versus moment magnitude energy that was measured. There was going to be a difference. Why is there a difference? So think about what's going on in the city, in the rock, that would make those two scales be very different. So very much an application-based assessment done in class. Here's some more examples. These are some examples of multiple choice questions, but getting at higher order thinking. This is a case study where this is presented, what then information helps them to answer the question. They're given a graph that they have to interpret. They have this geometry question where they have to design a box that will hold a certain number of cans. So these are all real life examples. Real life data. This is Google Earth. I have students apply what they know with plate tectonics to real data that they have in Google Earth of volcanoes, earthquakes, seafloor features, interpreting what they see. Done in class, formative. Matter of fact, I had a student, we just did that this week. A student, as they were doing this, says, now this stuff makes so much more sense because instead of me showing them figures, they're working with it, okay? Writing and reading assessments. This is the Tempest Choose. Basically, these questions, and what you're doing is you are developing your interpretation of the play's meaning based on these prompts that you're given. And then you explain why you chose that interpretation. Really great for reading type of assessments. And then this one I talked about what I learned from the text. You know, you're not just doing a book report, but this is what I learned, connecting it to my experiences and my beliefs. It's not just what you read, but actually what you learned from it. And that's a great formative assessment to do. And then finally, I want to give you 2 examples of using technology online to do assessments. This one's called the pedagogy wheel. And what it does is it gives you, and I have that in your packet, all sorts of apps that are the assessment tool to achieve that particular Bloom's level and verb, but with an app online. And what's key with this is that you're using the media as the tool, not as the assessment itself. Not just I'm using Skype to be using Skype, but Skype is the vehicle for the learning to happen. So helps them develop competence, but again, the tech is the tool, not the assessment. And that's really key. And this last one I gave you in your packet as well, this is a great example of doing digital assessments, blog commenting, hacking, playing, operating Boolean searches, tagging, programming, filming, things that can achieve those Bloom's levels online, technology-based assessments. Okay, lots and lots of ideas out there. So really just to kind of wrap up, make sure that your assessments give everyone the same opportunity to show that they learned and what they learned. It's consistent across your students. It's evaluating that level of thinking, that content knowledge that we talked about. There's a purpose for it. This is probably the most important one, as well as the validity. There's a reason behind why you're having them do those questions, but it's also realistic and challenging, and it's authentic, using real-life examples and experiences. And at the very end, make sure that you're not just doing the same assessment through the entire course, but have multiple types of assessments. Okay? Do y'all have any questions about that? Like I said, I wanted to show y'all a bunch of examples so you can see what beautiful variety is possible out there. And Google things. Say, Google application of evolutionary theory, or application of atmospheric pressures for an assessment. Something will pop up, I promise, because there's so much information out there. Any questions about what we talked about? Yes?
One question that is not directly like a question about assessing.
Yep.
Let's say in courses where content builds on top of each other, and maybe if you do an assessment and you realize that, let's say 5% of students do not meet the criteria, right? So what would be the next step there? I mean, because you technically can't stop the course just because of a small percentage, right? And for them, it's going to be even like worse and worse and worse because it just builds up on top of each other. So
what I would do is I would build into my syllabus the option for a retake or a rewrite or a redo. So if they score less than, say, 50% on a really key assessment, give them the opportunity like 1 or 2 times per semester to do a revamp review so that they don't get behind. And that also really helps alleviate the pressure and the anxiety of doing those higher stakes types of assessments. The whole idea of drafts is really key, not just with writing, but drafts on projects, drafts on any type of thing. Definitely build that into your course. Great question. Thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for being so participatory. It's always much more fun to have things going on in person. Thank y'all. Appreciate it.